Okay, so my computer says 12 o'clock, but my watch says we still have 30 seconds. So I'll just go ahead and get started. We'll wait for people to trickle in here. This will be recorded, so if you have to hop off for some reason, or want to access the information later, we will have that housed and we will communicate how you can access it. But good afternoon, everyone. My name's Emily Kring, and I am a Purdue Extension educator in the East Central Indiana region. And welcome to All About Invasives. This is a collaborative webinar series hosted by SICIM and Purdue Extension. We're excited to have you join us as we explore invasive species topics that impact our landscapes, our waterways, wildlife, and even our communities. So this series is designed to provide practical, research-based information and simple actions that we can all take to help protect native ecosystems and prevent the spread of invasive species. So whether you're a homeowner, gardener, landowner, outdoor enthusiast, or lifelong learner, we're glad you're here, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We hope today's session gives you helpful ideas and resources you can apply in your spaces. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jalen and let him introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Emily. And again, thanks everyone for joining us for our first installation of this series. I'm Jalen Sleet. I'm the East Central Regional Specialist with SICIM, the State of Indiana Cooperative for Invasive Species Management. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So first, I want to start with why is it important to plant native? So when we have our conventional gardens, our conventional lawns, these ecosystems are really an ecological desert. So you have plants that maybe have nectar or pollen at certain times of year for pollinators, but they don't actually support the whole life cycle of insects. They're not giving a full support of the ecosystem in that way. So when you don't have native plants where your pollinator species can lay their eggs, can have their larvae on specific host plants, then you're going to have less insects that can actually complete their whole life cycle in your landscape. So I have a graph on the right. This was a study that was done in Germany starting in the 90s, and it's just showing a really significant drop in insect biomass. And so they were looking at 92 different drivers for the loss of the insects populations in that country. And one of the biggest drivers was land use, particularly with agriculture. And I think that really translates to, our backyard here in Indiana. We're a big ag state. A lot of our, former forests and some of those smaller areas of wetlands and prairies are really fragmented. And so we have a lot of opportunity, I think, to reestablish native species in our residential areas, in our homes, and also in our privately owned forest lands and areas that are used for agriculture. So just thinking of, how can we better support that entire ecosystem, starting with the plants, and then that leads to having more of our insect diversity, and then those insects then support various bird species that are really need those caterpillars, especially this time of year in nesting season. Those caterpillars are a really important food source for our little hatchlings, our young birds, songbirds, quail, grouse, you name it. And so it's really important just from an ecological standpoint. And then other benefits of planting native are just reduced maintenance and input. A lot of our really popular horticultural plants are really finicky. You can think of your knockout roses, things like that. They really need a lot of particular care, whereas a lot of our native plants, you really just got to stick them in the ground. And if you have the right soil and the right water conditions, they really, can just kind of take care of themselves. And so that really also leads to having climate resiliency in our landscaping. Especially, I've personally observed, in Indiana, it seems like our droughts are getting longer. In the spring, we have really intense rainfall. And so you can really pick a lot of native species that are adapted to withstand some of those conditions and allow your landscaping to really contribute to being able to combat, different changing aspects of our climate. So the main bulk of this presentation, we're going to be looking at very specific one-to-one replacements for common invasive species. So I've broken it up into trees, shrubs, spring ephemerals, ground cover. So we're just going to do some examples in each of those categories. So starting out, the Bradford pear is a really popular street tree throughout the Midwest. Some other states have gotten ahead of the game and have banned it. Indiana has not yet banned Bradford pear. And so it's really very prevalent. You can find this blooming in early spring. If you go on I-70, you travel along any kind of busy highway, road, anywhere that's not mowed, and you have these disturbed sites, they really just sort of crop up, and they really just take over. Also in prairies or in agricultural fields that are being used for grazing, they really can take over in a lot of different contexts. Their flowers also smell they're not exactly a palatable scent. The fruits are inedible to humans, and it really doesn't have very many good things I can say about this invasive species. It's also very prone to storm damage due to the breeding it's taken place to get its that more or less desirable pyramidal shape, that form. Those branching structures um, they're at like an angle that doesn't allow it to actually have strength. A lot of our, more um, lateral branching structures are a lot stronger. And so if you have an ice storm or heavy wind damage, these are some of the first trees that split in the wind. So a really good replacement for this tree is the common serviceberry. So this tree supports a lot of different species of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. So there's over 90 different species that it supports. The fruits are also really good. I will try not to turn this into a foraging presentation, but the fruits are really good. They kind of taste like a blueberry apple sort of combination. If you can beat the birds and the squirrels to them, they're very beneficial for wildlife as well. They're a really early source of pollen and nectar. These are blooming really about the same time as the Bradford pears in March and into April. And this is one that's really popular in the landscaping industry now. So it's easy to get a hold of this tree to plant. And there's a few different species that you can choose from, and some of them have more of a conventional tree form. Other ones will have more of a shrub form. So this is just one example of an area in Ohio. I think this is in Butler County, where the Bradford pear really um, just kind of takes over in these kind of liminal spaces. So it's really one that I highly advocate removing from your property if you have the resources to do that. So next up, we have the Japanese tree lilac. This is still a commonly planted street tree. They're still planting this in my hometown in Richmond recently, and it has an emerging risk of invasiveness. It's been documented as escaping plantings. It's not quite on the level of calorie pear, but it's definitely one to watch out for. It produces a lot of seeds and it's self-pollinated. It's also susceptible to a lot of different sort of diseases. I've seen a lot of them have powdery mildew when we have a lot of rain in early spring and summer. A really good replacement for this is the flowering dogwood. This is another species that's going to support a lot of your moths and butterflies being a host plant. So those caterpillars can pupate on these native species, whereas they're not going to be able to do that with non-natives like Japanese tree lilac. The fruits are also really beneficial to birds. There's a really high fat content that's really a great source of energy for birds that are migrating in the fall. It's also just some of the species that it hosts are the spring azure butterfly and Cecropia moth. Next up, we have the golden rain tree. This is a really fast growing tree. It's very short lived, and the wood is also very brittle. So, this is one that's kind of hazardous to have in a yard. It's very fast growing, like I said, and it reseeds very quickly. The seeds only germinate in about a week, so it really has a pretty quick turnaround as far as it being able to repopulate. And this is extremely invasive in southern states. It's also being documented recently that it is escaping here in Indiana. There was one of our other regional specialists has seen this popping up, escaping some arboretums up in northwest Indiana. So this is definitely one to watch out for. And a good replacement for this would be the Ohio Buckeye. It has some pretty dramatic yellow flowers that are comparable. And as far as size, it can become a pretty large tree. It's not extremely fast growing, but it's a great tree to have in your yard. I think the blooms are beautiful, and it does support a good number of our native pollinators. It's a great source of shade. This is one of the very first trees to leaf out in the spring. And so you'll have, these trees will be leafing out a good month or so ahead of the rest of our native overstory trees. And just the shape of the flowers is very attractive to hummingbirds. And it's also, of course, provides food for squirrels. Next up, we have the princess tree. This is another emerging invasive. It's definitely escaping plantings. It grows very quickly. It's very similar to the golden rain tree in that it's fast growing, but it's very weak structurally. And so it's another kind of hazardous tree to have near, structures on your property. And secondly, it's also dangerous for structures on your property just because its roots are so invasive and it's so quickly growing that it's going to grow, out of cracks in concrete. It can grow, in a lot of areas where you don't necessarily want it. And they produce probably the most seeds out of any invasive that's in this presentation. Really large trees can produce up to 20 million seeds. And these are wind dispersed, so they can really travel in a very large radius. So, a great alternative to this princess tree would be the American linden. This is one of my personal favorites. Um, it's a large growing tree. They can easily be 80 foot tall. I think they've been documented growing up to 135 feet tall. So it's definitely not one you want right by your house, but if you have the space for these, it's a really great source of pollen and nectar in the middle of summer when there's kind of resources are getting lower, especially in kind of forested areas. And it's really kind of like a pollinator magnet. Anytime that these are blooming, you can literally hear the buzz of all the bees that are just thriving and getting that nectar and pollen. It also supports a lot of different Lepidoptera species as a host plant, including the eastern tiger swallowtail. And again, just kind of saying this tree, they grow really fast and comparatively pretty fast, and they can get really large. So it's not really one that I recommend having close to structures because they can frequently become hollow, and so they can kind of snap, with high winds, especially if they're hollow. And so they are a great source of nesting for cavity nesters, owls, squirrels, um, gray foxes. They're really great wildlife habitat if you have the room to accommodate them. So moving on to shrubs, we're going to start with burning bush. So burning bush is extremely invasive. Unfortunately, it's not on our terrestrial plant list of banned invasive species in Indiana yet, but it's very disruptive to our forests. I've seen areas where you'll have this really tall layer of the burning bush that's 20 feet tall, and then there's multiple layers under it, and they have really very dense, waxy leaves that cast a lot of heavy shade. And so a lot of the times I'll see nothing growing under the burning bush where they've escaped in natural areas except other burning bush. So it's a really intensive monoculture forming species when it escapes. And birds will spread the seeds of this far and wide so they can carry them, miles and miles away from your yard where you may not see it naturalizing. But if you have woods anywhere nearby, that's where those birds or where those seeds will be deposited. So luckily, this is one example where we have kind of a cousin species that's a native version. In this case, eastern wahoo is a great native alternative to burning bush that has very similarly striking fall foliage, and it's supporting a lot of different moths and butterflies. And the seeds are really beneficial to a lot of bird species. and these seeds persist on the plant pretty late into the season, so it's a really good kind of early winter, late fall food source for a lot of birds. And the nectar and the flowers are also really beneficial to a lot of our smaller bees and hoverflies. So this is just one example of how intense burning bush can be in the landscape. I believe this is taken somewhere in Indianapolis, where it's just as bad as honeysuckle. I think a lot of people are not surprised at how invasive honeysuckle can be in the forest, but burning bush can be just as bad in the right context. So speaking of honeysuckle, next up we have amberbush honeysuckle. This is a species that is regulated in Indiana, among a few other invasive bush honeysuckle species. Tartarian bush honeysuckle is another one that's regulated. So this species has allelopathic effects on the soil. It's really preventing a lot of our native species from germinating, and it's casting a lot of shade in those areas where it gets out of cultivation. The fruit is also really a pretty poor nutrition source for songbirds. I always tell students it's like if the birds are exclusively eating McDonald's, they're eating at gas stations. This fruit doesn't have the lipids, the fats. It doesn't have the protein that they need to be able to complete their long journeys as they migrate in the fall. So comparatively, we do have some native honeysuckle in Indiana. One of them is the coralberry. So I've actually been seeing this a lot lately. I've seen it in several different counties. I've seen it in Wayne County, Union County, Fayette County. So this is one that looks kind of similar to amberbush honeysuckle, but it's has a little bit smaller of a stature. The leaves are a bit smaller, and when it flowers and fruits, it's in these kind of clusters that are a little bit more packed than kind of the clusters you see on the left with the amberbush honeysuckle. And this species does support a pretty good number of moths and butterflies as a host plant. It's also browsed by deer and rabbits irregularly, so it does give a little bit of support to our mammals as a browse. And the fruits are enjoyed by a lot of songbirds, notably bobwhite quail, turkeys. There's a lot of different species that can utilize this plant. Next up, we have blunt-leaved privet. This is very often planted as a hedge, as you can see in this photo. And so, just as it is forming a very dense hedge here, when it escapes into the forest, it makes a very dense thicket that is not really utilized by wildlife. It's really more of an obstruction in the way that it forms. And this one is regulated in Indiana. This one is illegal to purchase, sell, transport. So a great alternative to this would be the American plum. So this is a thicket forming prunus species, and this is really one of it's really a keystone species. A lot of our prunus genus plants, they're supporting hundreds and hundreds of moss and butterflies as a host plant, and these flowers are really pretty prolific in the spring. These are blooming also about the same time as Calorie pear. I really enjoyed seeing a lot of these blooming on the roadsides this year. I kind of started to get an eye for them. So they really spread further, horizontally than they do vertically. They can get, over 25 feet tall, but usually they have more of a spreading kind of habit. So they're really a great source of cover habitat on your edges. They do best in full sun, but they can handle a little bit of shade as well. But you'll definitely get more flowers and fruit production in full sun. The fruits aren't um, as much of a desirable food source for native fauna, but they are edible to humans as well. There's some different places out there that are breeding them to have more characteristics for edibility. They're pretty sour. So I have sampled a few, and it's kind of hit or miss if you actually want to eat these without cooking them down. Next up, we have the Japanese barberry. This is another regulated species in Indiana. It forms really dense thickets, and the thorns are really pretty gnarly. And it's able to form by roots, seed, and also branch layering. So if just one tip of one of the branches touches the ground, it will root and it just kind of keeps, sort of leapfrogging through the woods. So it's able to spread very quickly. And out east, it's been associated with increases in Lyme disease, largely due to the cover that it provides rodents, and it forms these really kind of cool and moist areas that ticks can really thrive in. And they're, of course, the main vector for Lyme disease. So there's kind of multiple issues that come about from the Japanese barberry. And a really good replacement for this would be the American black currant or really any of our gooseberries. They have a really similar form. The American black currant doesn't have spines or thorns. Some of our other gooseberry species do. If you really want to have a spiky, thorny shrub in your yard, there are some native alternatives there. It has a really attractive flower to a lot of our native bees. The fruits are pretty delicious for humans, birds, and other mammals. And it does support a lot of different moths and butterflies, notably one of our threatened species, the horicoma, excuse me. So next we'll move on to some of our grasses. So first up we have the pampas grass. This is really popularly planted in a lot of areas where I'm at, and golf courses, on university campuses. This is really kind of one of those old school conventional clumping grasses. Unfortunately, it produces a lot of seed. And these are wind dispersed seeds, so they really travel quite far. I've seen it naturalize in areas nearby golf courses. It really can just, spread very rapidly and it forms really thick rhizomes. It can be very challenging to remove it once it's established. So a really good alternative to this would be big blue stem. This is another really large clump forming grass that is native to tall grass prairies. So Indiana is really not the prairie state, but I think, planting some of these grasses that are native to, our general region would still provide a lot more ecological benefit than having, something from South America like pampas grass. So the big blue stem, it's a really great source of cover for a lot of different birds and mammals. It's really great cover for nesting birds, birds that nest on the ground in particular. And the seed heads are a great source of food for a wide variety of birds, goldfinches, quail, turkeys. There's all kinds of birds that will eat these seeds. And this grass and a lot of the other native grasses that I'll promote are a really good host plant for skipper butterflies as a larval host. And next up, we have the maiden grass. This is another really common one that I see planted quite a bit. This one, again, is spreading by rhizome and by wind dispersed seeds. They really are prolific seeders, and they can easily colonize disturbed areas. Again, if you see this planted on a golf course, just look around, drive around that area, and you're very likely to see that it's escaped in some other areas. And this one is also really flammable. So this isn't as huge of a concern in Indiana where we don't have a major wildfire risk, but I think it is worth noting, with climate change, I think our drought seasons are getting much longer and more intense. And I see a lot more burn bans than I recall seeing growing up. And so just having the potential for these invasive species to spread and contribute to fire risk is definitely something that I keep in mind, and just another reason not to plant these invasive species. So one good replacement for this would be Indian grass, and this one is really easy to get a hold of in nurseries. Again, it's another great host for skipper butterflies. The seeds are going to be beneficial to birds in your yard. A lot of these species, I think, the comparison of a conventional, kind of European influenced garden is that you have a lot of these species that don't necessarily provide food for your birds. So then you have a bird feeder. You still want birds in your yard. You could just plant the plants that are going to provide that food up front. And I think, it's going to be a lot more beneficial overall. And you have more of those ecosystem services that are being provided holistically that way, including of course, cover. A lot of these grasses kind of have some of those very similar benefits that they're providing. And then next up, we have fountain grass. So this one is a really huge issue in Hawaii and out west where they do have, a natural fire regime. And so it's really altering that wildfire cycling. These really dry out early in the season and they spread really rapidly, especially in those climates. And so they really just increase the risk of more intense wildfire where it goes from being, a lower level fire that is periodic to regular intervals of really intensive high heat fire that's outside of that normal regime. And a really good replacement for this would be switchgrass. So switchgrass is again great source of seed, source of food for birds. It's a host plant, whereas all of these non-native grasses are not hosting any of our native insects. And the switchgrass in particular is another one that's going to get really tall, can be 6 to 9 feet tall. So one thing to consider with these ornamental grass alternatives is that these are all pretty large forming grasses. And so if you have kind of a small area, you might just want to think of alternatives to grasses in general. If you wanted, a more well-behaved sort of grass, prairie dropseed, side oats grama. There's a lot of other native grasses that will stay a lot smaller and are a little bit more well-behaved in terms of how they respond to a small area, not just totally taking it over. And then one more grass alternative. This is really more for wet areas. So this is kind of maybe a preview to the pond clinic coming up later in our lineup later this summer. So one really common escapee is the common reed. So it's forming really dense monocultures, as you can see in this photo, in wetlands, ditches, floodplains, disturbed areas. It really can take over pretty rapidly. They can spread by root by 20 feet per year, and they're really affecting our water table in a way that our native grasses do not. They're taking up much more water, and this is a species that is on our terrestrial plant rule. So one alternative to this plant would be the soft stem bulrush, which is not a grass, it's a rush. But this is a great alternative. They're providing a lot of habitat in terms of food, nesting habitat, coverage for various waterfowl. A lot of ducks, geese are going to be eating these seeds, and they can use this as a cover from predation. And the underwater vegetative cover is also great for a variety of fish that will be spawning in your pond or in lakes. And they're also kind of giving that cover underwater for those younger fish to have some protection. I've also seen that these are pretty beneficial in vernal pools if you have a smaller temporary body of water that's really more for amphibians. These bulrush really give a lot of nice cover to those young salamanders or tadpoles as well. So then we'll move on to spring ephemerals. So Siberian squill, Scilla siberica. This is a really challenging invasive species that I've personally been managing this on a number of properties here in Wayne County. This one is really can be difficult to manage because it spreads so rapidly by seed and bulbs. And it has a really waxy cuticle. So if this does get established, if you have this planted in your yard, there's kind of limited success in terms of using herbicide to control it. So prevention is really the key thing that I'm advocating for people. Like if you have a small amount of this, start digging it up now. Especially if you're close to any kind of natural area, this very readily spreads in our forest. And I've never seen, even honeybees, non-native honeybees, I've never seen any pollinators visiting these plants. And I've seen areas where there's acres and acres of these flowers in the spring. So they really have a really high potential to invade our forests. A really good alternative to Siberian squill is wild hyacinth. It has a very comparable sort of waxy leaf. And it's also going to behave similarly in terms of its time above ground. It'll bloom later. Some of these are still blooming right now in my area. These really kind of bloom from April into May. And in natural areas, I usually find these. They can do well both in dry and wetter sites. I've seen them very frequently in floodplains where I think there is pretty sandy soil, so it's well draining, but they can handle some extra moisture. And I also see them in really kind of dry mesic slopes as well. And these flowers are really attractive to a lot of our bees and flies. Um, and they do spread kind of slowly. So it's kind of best plant if you can get bulbs to plant them that way. Growing them by seed, it'll take a pretty long time before you actually get the showy flowers. So this is just one example of how readily the psylla can spread, and this is on a campus. I've also seen it spread just in the middle of forest. It's really it's very good at spreading and choking out any of our spring ephemerals. And you really have a short window to treat this plant. It's only going to be above ground for 2 weeks to a month or so. So this is definitely one to watch out for. The next up, we have snowdrops. These are another spring ephemeral bulb that's pretty popular, and it does readily naturalize in forest. It spreads by bulbils and seed. This one I don't think is demonstrating quite as an extreme invasiveness as some of these other species in this presentation, but I have seen it spread pretty rapidly where it has nice, well-draining soil. And I've seen a few examples of people's gardens where it has rapidly spread into the forest. So this is really one I think prevention is key to stop this from becoming one of those next, big invasives. So there's quite a few different alternatives. I settled on bloodroot. There's a lot of lovely spring ephemerals that have white flowers that are going to be blooming shortly after the snowdrop, so that early spring, late March into May. So with the bloodroot in particular, they're a really good source of pollen, mining bees, sweat bees, honeybees, a lot of different flies, a lot of these early season pollinators that are out and about in April are really going to benefit from having this plant around. It's also a host to a lot of native moths, and the foliage does stick around a little bit longer than most of our conventional spring ephemerals that really go dormant completely within a month or so. These leaves can persist for a while, so it can be kind of a good ground cover as well. It can fill in some shady areas in the yard. It also is a great source of food for ants, which I imagine a lot of folks don't necessarily want ants near their house, but with these spring ephemerals, most of our native spring ephemerals have a relationship with ants, and ants will disperse their seeds. So they're really good at sort of spreading themselves that way, which is a nice thing to have in the yard, in your garden. Next up, we have winter aconite. This is another really early blooming non-native species. This is usually one of the first non-native spring ephemerals that I see bloom, so it's usually in February. This one does very readily naturalize in forest. It spreads by tubers and by seed. So I've seen it form really dense mats of vegetation, particularly in kind of rich, moist soil in floodplains. I've seen where this is the only thing growing on that herbaceous layer in the forest floor. So a really good alternative to this is another beautiful yellow flower, the trout lily. So this one is also going to spread by runners, but it does so in a much slower way. And it does stabilize soil. I've seen in a lot of areas on slopes. This is really kind of forming this mat, but it still allows a lot of other diverse species of spring ephemerals to exist and coexist with it. So it's not forming a dense monoculture in the same way that winter aconite does. It also supports a very specific trout lily bee, the trout lily adrena bee. So this is one example of where you have a native species that has a specialist insect that completely relies on that one genus or species of plant. So this is where, you really, I think when we think of save the bees, we have over 5,000 native species of bees. A lot of those are specialists rather than generalists. So, the more that we can support them by planting the one plant that they can complete their life cycle on, I think that that's definitely a net positive that we can do just as individuals and landowners. Next up, we have Great Hyacinth. This is another really challenging bulb, spring ephemeral bulb to manage. This one really does spread very rapidly. I know of a couple of properties where there are acres of grape hyacinth that have moved into the forest from an original homeowner garden planting. And there's some areas I've seen it where it spreads so rapidly that the green vegetation almost just looks like grass once it's finished flowering or hasn't flowered yet. And if you try to dig these up, you'll see there's hundreds of little tiny bulbs. So it spreads very quickly, and those seeds germinate pretty quickly. And so it can be a real challenge to remove this because it's not very susceptible to most herbicides, largely in part because it has a really waxy cuticle. So that leaf, it's very difficult to get it to absorb the herbicide. And so, digging is really a major challenge when you think of just how many bulbs are in one or, in the square feet of one small garden area. So this is another one, prevention is really key if you want to stop this from taking over even just your yard or a nearby forest. So I found they are very invasive, especially in the right soils. In heavy clay soil, I don't think they spread quite as quickly, but it's still something that you want to kind of keep an eye out for. This is really commonly planted in a lot of older homes, I found. So one replacement for this would be the Virginia bluebell. This is a great native spring ephemeral that blooms in early April and into mid-April. So it's a great early source of nectar for a lot of our native bees, particularly the long-tongued bees, because it has this sort of trumpet shape where they can get access to that nectar. It also is a great host for a variety of moth species. And then we'll move on to some different ground covers. So English ivy is a pretty notorious invasive species. The website the nursery that I got this image from, they were actually advocating that you plant non-invasive English ivy that's sterile. So there's really a lot of kind of mental gymnastics that I think a lot of these plants are still being sold, and a lot of the times they're sold as being sterile. But then if they're, cross-pollinated by, a wild type or, and a type that's escaped cultivation, a lot of times they'll get pollinated anyway. That's very much the case for the purportedly sterile Bradford pears. So it's really something to look out for, even with a lot of these non-native, some of the sellers kind of know that they're invasive, and so they try to use language that kind of justifies planting them. So with the English ivy, it very much suffocates the understory. It just completely takes over, forms this dense mat that you really won't even have that many other quote unquote weeds that will grow through this. It's just kind of, it's very much a case of an ecological dead zone where nothing is able to thrive in this. And so it's not supporting those native insects. It's not a host plant for any of our native insects. And so a great alternative is the Virginia creeper. Virginia creeper is not really going to form as dense of a ground cover as English ivy, but I think it's one that really can help fill in those gaps, especially in a high shade area. But it's also adaptable to full sun, so it can really play a lot of different roles as you need it in your particular landscaping site. The fruits are really highly nutritious for songbirds, and they are sought out by a lot of songbirds. It's also a host plant for a lot of different moths, including the Virginia creeper sphinx. Another ground cover that I see is both planted and is kind of just, is a weed in its own right and escapes a lot of the time is the bugleweed. So it spreads really quickly by runners. It forms a dense vegetative mat, and it can be kind of a challenge to get rid of it, especially if you just want to pull it. It definitely can regrow from those fragments of roots left behind, like a lot of invasives can. So a great alternative that has a lovely showy purple flower is our wild geranium. So this one is pretty widely attainable in the nursery industry. I think it's important to make sure you get the actual native version of wild geranium. So I've included the Latin names. That can really help kind of reduce, confusion when you're buying plants if it's just called crane's bill or there's a lot of these different common names that get thrown around. So there are some particular there's some particular geraniums that are not native and aren't gonna provide the same ecological benefit as our native one. So it's providing, with a lot of these native flowering species, it's providing pollen and nectar early in the spring for a lot of our native bees, butterflies, and in particular, this one has another specialist, the crane's bill mining bee, that requires wild geranium as a host. Another ground cover is monkey grass, lyrope. It's pretty easily escapes gardens, and so it's demonstrated there's potential for invasiveness. In Indiana, it hasn't been documented as being a rapidly spreading escapee, but there's definitely some precedent for that. Further out east, there's some other states that have already began regulating it or listing it as a noxious weed. So a great replacement for this would be Ohio spiderwort. It's another, purple flower that's quite showy, and the leaves are very similar in terms of their shape and their growth form compared to Lyrope, and they're very good at kind of spreading vegetatively in an area. So they can be aggressive. So that's something to look out for. But I guess if you're replacing Lyrope, you probably want something aggressive in that area. And they're really, when they're blooming, it's a kind of a really important period of time in early summer or midsummer where you have a lot of butterflies, moths, a lot of pollinators are out and about, and so it really provides kind of a magnet to them. And notably, it is a host for the golden looper moth. There's a number of different moth species that it's a larval host for. Moving on to the orange daylily, also known as the ditch lilies. This is a pretty commonly planted kind of ground cover. It really forms a pretty dense mat that sticks around for a lot of the year. I see this a lot of the times in like old homesteads, and you can see where it spreads into natural areas, especially if there's like a fair amount of water, or of course in a ditch where it gets its common name, ditch lily. So they spread pretty quickly by bulb, by rhizome, or tuber, excuse me. And so it's really one of those that I don't think is being actively planted quite as much now. I think it's fallen a little bit out of popularity, but like this, I've been removing this at my mom's house and replanting a variety of native species. So this is one where if you have it, it's worth removing it and replacing it with an alternative such as the Michigan lily, which is actually a true lily. The ditch lily is not an actual lily, but the Michigan lily and a few other Canada lily is another similar one. They have this really dramatic flower that attracts a lot more pollinators than the orange daylily or ditch lily. It's a really good source of nectar. Kind of in the middle of summer, hummingbirds will frequent these, and a lot of really large butterflies and moths also take advantage of this. And it will form not super dense, but it will form pretty widespreading, just like low growing vegetation. And then, depending on how much sunlight it's getting, you will have these pretty tall flowering spikes that will come out. So they do a lot better in terms of getting your actual flowering in more full sun and in moist soil. But they're perfectly fine in shady areas. You just won't get quite as much of a dramatic flowering. So now that we've looked at a lot of different species examples of, what can I replace this and that with? A great question you may have is where do I buy these native plants? So some of the species that I went through are pretty readily available at just conventional nurseries. But a lot of these species are can be a little bit harder to source, particularly like the spring ephemerals can be a little more challenging. The Indiana Native Plant Society has a great map here on the right that shows a lot of different places where you can get native plants. So if you go to their website, you can see each of these pins, and there's information about each of those sellers. But some of my favorites that I have personal experience with are Woody Warehouse. This is located in Liston, Indiana. So it's kind of just west of Indianapolis. They are kind of your best source for shrubs, trees, and they have really obscure species that are harder to get elsewhere. And they really have really great quality in terms of their, success of the plants that you're getting. And you can really get a range of 1 gallon to, as big of a tree as you really want to buy. Um, there's also a lot of local resources. A lot of our soil and water conservation districts have plant sales throughout the year. So definitely check with your local soil and water district. A lot of them in my area of Wayne County, we have a lot of different soil and water county or soil and water districts that have more of like herbaceous plants are being sold right now, and then they'll do a tree sale in the fall. So definitely reach out to your local people there. Another one that's located in East Central Indiana and Central Indiana, Native Plants Unlimited. They have a number of sort of flash sales or limited season sales where they have spring ephemerals, they have trees, shrubs. You can buy seeds from them. So there's a lot of different options there in Indiana and just across the border in Illinois or in Ohio. So, lastly, I want to leave you with some information on how to find out if fill in the blank if your species you're dealing with is native. So, the Indiana Native Plant Society is a great source of information here. If you post good pictures of whatever species you're working with, you will have people chomping at the bit to answer your question on whether this is native or not, where it's native to, and providing information on that plant. SICIM, our website, is a really great resource. We have a lot of um, fact sheets, and there's a variety of information that you can gather just from the website, or you can reach out to your regional specialist to get more information. And we provide technical assistance, landowner surveys. We really do a lot in terms of providing free services for landowners to get familiar with the invasives and learn how to manage those on their properties. Purdue Extension also is a great resource. You can email or call any of those folks in your regions, and they would be happy to help you. A couple other ones are iNaturalist. This is my preferred app that I use on my phone to identify plants, mushrooms, fungi, you name it. And the nice thing about iNaturalist is that your observations can contribute more to the scientific community compared to like a Picture This app or some of those other apps. They're not really utilized in the industry in the same way that iNaturalist is. And then lastly, Bone App is a really great plant atlas for North America where if you can look up the scientific name for the species that you're looking at or just the genus in general, you can see down to the county level whether something's native, if it's threatened, if it's introduced. It'll give you all of that information for virtually any plant that you can think of. That's a great place to start with. So I left a little bit of time for questions. I'm not sure. I haven't been checking the chat if we have anything that's popped up.
The question I see is I would like to know if at the end of the presentation we can get a copy of the slides. So, Jalen, whether you'd like that to be in the recording or yeah, what your preference is there, we can follow that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share the slides. Our plan is also we've recorded this, so we're wanting to house this series on the SICM YouTube channel so that you can, use it as a reference. You can go back and rewatch it, or slow it down. I probably talked a little fast to get through all of the slides, but yeah, happy to share the slides with you.
Perfect. Are there any other burning questions? I'm sure some people's hearts were broken seeing some of those different plants that are actually invasive. I know mine was. Let's see. Erica said, "Thanks, Jalen. How are you getting rid of the orange daylilies?" That's the one that broke my heart. Do you have to dig
Yeah.
them up? Also, please do a foraging class.
Yeah, so with the daylilies, so two questions or with one stone. So the foraging, you can eat the bulb or the tubers on daylily. Um I don't know if am I frozen? It looks
Yeah.
um, but yeah, you can eat the tubers on the daylilies. Really, I think your best bet is kind of to do a foliar application. So just like a 2% glyphosate would work well, or you can dig them up. That's really painstaking. I did not do a great job of digging up all of the tubers where I'm removing them at my mom's house. But they're really not too hard to dig up. It's just kind of a year after year thing. I would definitely recommend fully removing them before you plant anything. That was my learning experience. There's a lot more of those tubers than I realized.
Right. Any last minute questions here? I just sent out a Zoom survey, so this helps us know how we did and what to do next time for you all. If you have any specific interests on topics, please feel free to put that at the bottom of that Zoom poll that I just sent. You all are welcome to linger and continue to ask questions, but thanks for joining us today for this session. I wanted to mention that our next session, Jalen alluded to it in his presentation, it's going to be on July 10th, and we'll be talking about your pond with invasives. So, tips on identifying, preventing, and managing invasives in pond environments. Um, and yeah, thanks to Jalen with SICIM for presenting today. And we hope to see you all at our next session. So, again, we'll be housing this in or on SICIM's YouTube channel. So, we'll send out that information as well. So,